Now, welcome to another edition of Let's Talk Some Star Wars, where this time we'll be taking a look at the results of the poll that asked, in hindsight, what do you think the sequel trilogy should have been? I'll then be reading and responding to some comments, as well as showing off the artwork that was sent in this week. Okay, so let's right away take a look at the results here, where we'll see that nearly half of the 62,000 who voted, or 49%, said that it should have been George Lucas's version of the sequel trilogy or a story based off of that. 20% then said it should have taken a story from the EU or been based heavily off of it. 18% then said some sort of combination of all of the above. 11% said it should have been something completely different. And a final 3% said they were happy with the sequel trilogy we got from Disney. And before going on here, I will give the usual disclaimer that these results do not necessarily reflect the thoughts or opinions of the whole fan base. As I always say, another channel, one run by someone who loves the sequel trilogy and has many like-minded viewers, would likely get some very different results, especially in terms of the number of people happy with the Disney sequel trilogy. So in all reality, a more accurate number might fall between this poll and that theoretical poll run by another channel. Still, this is 62,000 fans who, by and large, would have preferred something other than what we got. And though in the grand scheme of things, or when thinking about the millions and millions of Star Wars fans out there, this is not a huge number, it's still not a small number, and they're certainly not alone. In other words, I think we can safely say a lot of fans, or a sizable percentage, think the sequels should have been something other than what we got, or they thought they should have never been made in the first place, and we'll get more into that when we get to the comments, which I think it's a good time to do. And as usual, big thank you to everyone who votes and comments. I really do appreciate it. And now let's get started, as we always do, with the top-rated comment, which this time came to us from Captain DC, who said, "They had a script, they had the money, they had the lore, they had Star Wars. George Lucas gave them everything, but they threw it away. I don't hate what they did, I'm disappointed." First of all, great comment, and you're right, I think. Disney had everything going for them. As I've said before, and some will disagree, but I don't think it would have been that hard to make a sequel trilogy that most fans would have liked. And that's not to say that Star Wars fans are generally simple or easy to please. I think that's clearly not the case. Just that I think the list of things people wanted to see in the sequels was actually relatively short. And as long as they got those few things and they were then surrounded by some sort of even semi-competent and coherent story with a good payoff at the end, most fans would have been at the very least relatively satisfied with the trilogy. Because, let's be honest here, what did most fans want out of the sequels? To see the old characters in action one last time, to get one more adventure out of them. Some fans had literally been waiting over 3 decades just to see the proverbial band get back together one last time on the big screen, and to maybe see them save the day one more time. And I think we all understood going into this that the whole trilogy wasn't going to focus on them. We were okay with that. We knew that we'd get new characters and the focus would certainly shift to them by the end. But splitting up Han and Leia, doing what they did with Luke, making Lando little more than an afterthought in the 3rd movie, and all these other things, that's just not what a lot of fans wanted. And I can understand if you're someone who really enjoyed what we got with the sequels, but I don't understand how you can't understand how or why others didn't like it. Why this was one of the most disappointing things ever for them. Alright, let's now move on to this comment from Kodrin Dankulia, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Anyway, they said, "I don't think we should have gotten anything. Episode 6 was perfect closure for the saga. That ending gets me teary-eyed every time. Why we got 3 more movies to end up a crappier ending is beyond me." Okay, so as I just got done saying a moment ago, I do believe that a trilogy that most people liked wouldn't have been that hard to make. But by far the hardest part of it would have been trying to stick the landing. Or how do you end it better or have it be on par with what we got before? Because, in my opinion, the end of Return of the Jedi is flawless. I've watched that film I don't even know how many times in my life. I want to say, especially considering I watched it nearly weekly as a kid, that it's somewhere in the ballpark of 100 times, which sounds ridiculous and exaggerated or impossible, but it's probably around that many times. Anyway, each time I watch it to this very day, I just appreciate that ending more and more. Like I said, it's flawless, and I don't know if there's anything that could be done to top it. Your only hope is to somehow be somewhere on par with it, or maybe to add more meaning to the original ending of the saga, which I almost think is the better route to take. And to do that, you have to have a hell of a 3-movie game plan in place leading up to that ending. That's your Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's your only hope. And I think it's pretty clear that wasn't the case with the sequels we got. Okay, and moving on now, we have this comment from Lothar Schmal, who said, "None really. Should have been an entirely different story. There's no need for episode 7. We also had this comment from Mardijan Keat, and again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing names here, that's my speciality. Anyway, they said, "I'm still doubting a sequel trilogy should have been made, but if so, then it should have been George Lucas's version that guides it." We also then had this comment from Forest Side Talk, who said, "I believe there shouldn't have been a sequel trilogy at all. The 6 films did a great job of telling a story from start to finish of Anakin's tragedy and redemption. The series already ended perfectly, with no loose ends at Return of the Jedi. Why risk ruining it by adding more episodic films?" Which they did. And the simple answer here is money. There was no way Disney wasn't going to make a sequel trilogy and capitalize off those titles of episodes 7, 8, and 9. Just like I wouldn't be stunned when maybe 10 to 15 years from now, the Skywalker saga will continue with yet another trilogy, and in honor of Spaceballs, maybe they can call it The Quest for More Money. Though to be fair here, it's easy enough to say after the fact that maybe there shouldn't have been or we didn't need a sequel trilogy, but I think most of us fans wanted one. Again, I think we all wanted to see the heroes of old have one last adventure together. And the funny part, speaking of hindsight, is that Disney's best course of action would have been to not call it the sequel trilogy, I think, to say that this story follows what happened before, but it's separate from it in some respect. That wouldn't have made the movies themselves better, but I think maybe some would tolerate them more, who knows. Okay, next up here we have this comment from Elijah Rodriguez, who said, "Hey, remember when George Lucas got so much scrutiny over the prequels that he sold Lucasfilm? Anyone? I do." Well, I actually don't remember that. I remember him getting married shortly after selling Lucasfilm and then having another child shortly after that, almost as if maybe he wanted to reprioritize his life in his later years, that maybe he wanted to see his version of the sequel trilogy still get made, so he promoted a thought to be good and close and trusted friend, that being Kathleen Kennedy, to president of Lucasfilm, and then sold to Disney in the hopes that she'd bring his vision to the big screen, while he maybe helped from the sidelines and spent most of his time with his family. And look, in all seriousness here, no one other than George Lucas himself knows exactly why he sold. But one thing to keep in mind is that Lucas never set out to create arguably the greatest, most popular franchise in the history of anything ever. Sure, he loved Star Wars. He loved his creation. I don't doubt that in the least, but I think he wanted to do other things with his life as well. In fact, when he sold to Disney, he joked that he was now going to make very small, independent films, the type he'd always wanted to make, and he had no plans of showing them off to anybody. He just wanted to make them for himself. In other words, I think Lucas sold because he knew what Star Wars meant to so many people, and that he wanted to see it endure for many more generations to come, but he didn't have it in him to personally give it to people anymore. He wanted his sequels to get made, but he didn't want to spend potentially the last years of his life making them. He wanted to enjoy the things that maybe he rarely had time for over the years, and who can blame him for that? Okay, and next up here then we have this comment from Leaping Monkey, who said, "One that borrowed the best of worthy stories, characters, and elements from the EU, refined them, and added some of George's ideas for the wills and whatnot. George would be involved, but not too much so. Really, there's many great possibilities and ideas that could have been made from any truly creative and imaginative team of people with a plan who actually know how to write a good story. I'm not even asking for a near perfect one, just a good one. But the Disney trilogy, sorry, but it just doesn't cut it at the end of the day. You'd have to fundamentally not understand the Star Wars story as a whole to make and greenlight what we actually got." And I do personally think something like this was probably their best bet, to take some of George's ideas, which were a bit out there as many pointed out in the comments, and to blend them with some EU, and to infuse some brand new ideas altogether. Maybe you end up with some sort of abomination that everybody hates, But maybe you end up with the best of all worlds that most people love. I don't really know. I do know that in many ways making a clone of the original trilogy that barely had any of the old characters together, and worse yet, changed many of them, wasn't the wisest of options. And moving along now, we have this comment from Jamel Witted, who said, completely different story, something else in the quote-unquote huge galaxy. And you know, I wonder how people would have reacted to that if Disney had just come out of the gates with something completely new and different. The irony, of course, is that yes, you would have had some fans, a lot of fans, outraged that they weren't using the original characters and actors, or that they spent all this money for Star Wars and weren't using the parts of it everyone knows and loves. And I'm not saying Disney was in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. Again, I'll say it wouldn't have been the hardest thing in the world to give us a decent story that focused more on the old characters, especially at the start of the trilogy. But again, we are talking hindsight here. And I can't help but wonder where we'd be now if Disney had said, screw it, let's just go with something completely new, in a different time and place in this galaxy. And that way they could have just kept the EU not only as canon, but kept it going in the form of more books, comics, and theoretically, movies down the road. Okay, let's now get to just a few more comments, starting with this one from Alex Runyon, who said, I'd be fine with what we got except with some tweaks to The Last Jedi, and making Kylo the actual villain in The Rise of Skywalker, instead of randomly bringing in Palpatine. Then we had this comment from Aquarius Man, who said, preferably I would have had George Lucas collaborate with the writers like in the OT. Don't give him complete control, but don't ignore his ideas. Then we had this comment from Bertrand Shaline, who said, the real answer is everything but what we actually got. Then this comment from It's Joey Your Bro, who said, EU, it would have been great to see characters that started on paper end up in live action, just like the MCU. Then this comment from Joe Siebert, who said, what was the one unresolved storyline at the end of Return of the Jedi? Luke still had to restore the Jedi Order. Why was that relegated to backstory and flashback and not the central plot of this entire trilogy? Then this comment from Katie Robinson, who said, George Lucas is Star Wars. His treatments should have been used, period. Borrowing from the EU would have helped too. Then this comment from Nick, who said, the sequel trilogy had really redeeming qualities. The cast is a perfect example. I think that if they had just given the movie some time and development, they would have been great. And finally here, this comment from Connor Newman, who said, George Lucas is Star Wars is George Lucas. And as much as I do agree with that simple statement, if there's to be a future for Star Wars, it does have to find a way to exist without him. And I certainly do think there are people up to that task. That's been proven with shows like The Mandalorian. That said, I do think that maybe the best option for Disney was to just go with Lucas's ideas as is for the sequel trilogy. As I've said before in other videos, that really could have almost been a win-win scenario for Disney. If you make them the Lucas way and people don't react well to them, then they have a free pass to pretty much do whatever they want with the next movies from the fans. However, if they're great, you've then honored the last part of George Lucas's greatest legacies, and you're free to do what you want after that, more or less. And yeah, I know it seems that they already thought after the prequels they had the fans' blessings to move away from what Lucas had done, and they thought something more in line or just like the original trilogy was their best bet. But maybe the most ironic thing in all of this is them believing the prequels were so hated and all but shunning them in this new trilogy, or so it felt. It seems to have made people go back and take a second look at them, and those who maybe weren't originally overly fond of them, well, some of them are now having a change of heart. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think the sequels should have been, or to tell me what you thought about what I or anyone else had to say in this video. Either way, do leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.